So we have been doing this sermon series about doubt, about uncertainty, about unbelief. And we started out kind of calmly with that idea of God helping our unbelief. That sometimes we believe, but our belief isn't as strong as we might want it to be, and we need help with those areas where we don't believe, where we're having trouble with belief, where we have unbelief. And we can ask God for that help. Then we moved on to those times when we can't hear God, when we can't see God, when we're not so sure if we can feel God, when God is in the silence, in the quiet, and we have to listen very carefully, very closely to find God. And then last week we got into the dark nights of the soul. Those times when we're not sure that God is there at all, and when all we have is frustration and sadness and despair and anger towards that God who we are not sure is there at all. And we talked about yelling at God, which is at least a little bit of faith. Maybe God is there to be yelled at, and how God can handle that and take that in and help us through that. How God is there for us even in our despair. And now we're on the upward swing of this series. We've had the most depressing sermon. Now we are getting back into hope. And I made this distinction last week that I think will be useful as we move forward. This distinction between intellectual doubt, the kind of doubt that makes you go, walking on water seems hard and kind of unlikely. I'm not so sure how that would work. Or the archaeological evidence for the Exodus isn't great. I wonder how to square that with what we know from history. The kind of doubt of the mind. I made a distinction between that kind of doubt and emotional doubt. The kind of doubt that makes us go, how can there be a God in a world where all of this lousy stuff is happening? Have you looked around lately? Surely there cannot be a God who is love in charge of all of this. That kind of doubt of the soul. And I said we'd talk a little bit about intellectual doubt. So I want to talk about that for just a sec before we get into the depths of this story, because this story, the story about Thomas, is often treated like it's intellectual doubt, like it's doubt of the mind, like Thomas just has some questions. And I'm not quite sure that's all that's going on here. So I want to say intellectual doubt is fine. I mean, emotional doubt is also fine. Doubt is part of life. It is a thing that we go through. It is part of the human experience. But that intellectual doubt, that kind of thing that's just questions about God, questions about Scripture, questions about history, questions about the story of our faith, that's a great kind of doubt. That is kind of a wondrous kind of doubt, because that is the kind of doubt that can spark curiosity about things. That can make us go, I wonder, and then look deeper and find ways to get beyond the surface of our faith into the depths of this idea of Christ, into the depths of the gospel, into the depths of the good news in ways that we couldn't before. Intellectual doubt, the doubt of the mind, can lead us further into faith. And that's great. So, that is to say, if you have intellectual doubts, if you have wonderings, if you have curiosities, let's let those fly. And we can talk about them and reason together and argue together and get deeper into stuff. Intellectual doubt is fine. But emotional doubt, that doubt of the soul, can be more troubling. It can lead us to places we really don't want to go. And I think that our story today, our story about Thomas, is a combination of both of these. So I want to walk you through it just a little bit, because Thomas is often this figure who is cast as the villain. Ah, Thomas, you doubted when you shouldn't have doubted. We're going to call you Doubting Thomas, and we're going to say you're the bad guy for having questions. And sometimes Thomas is cast as the hero. Oh, Thomas, who demanded evidence for a pretty extraordinary claim. That's the right thing to do. You had questions. You wanted proof. Good Thomas. And the thing is, it's a little bit of both. Thomas is not in a good place right now. Thomas knows, without a doubt, that his friend, his teacher, his Lord, Jesus Christ, has been betrayed and arrested and crucified and laid in a tomb. He knows that. He saw a good chunk of it. He heard more of it. It is not something that is up for question. Those things happened. And now, what's he supposed to do? He's been following this guy for years, this guy who he thought was going to usher in God's reign of love. And beyond that, overthrow the Roman Empire and restore Israel to glory and free his people. And that guy is dead in a tomb. That's not just intellectual. That's emotional. That's not just a matter of the mind. That's a matter of the soul. He is down. And then he starts to hear stories. He has heard that Mary Magdalene went to the tomb and encountered the risen Christ and came back and told the disciples he was there, told the disciples that Christ is risen. And that sounded unlikely. I mean, there was the thing with Lazarus where he was risen, but Jesus coming back and not coming and seeing the disciples immediately, not coming and letting Thomas know right away, that just seems unlikely. That seems hard to believe. Plus, let's face it, this is the first century, and Mary Magdalene is a woman, and you know how they are. But then the other disciples come to Thomas later, and they're like, we were together in a room, you weren't there, and we're sorry that you weren't there. But we were alone in a room, and Jesus appeared to us. Christ appeared to us. He wished peace upon us, and he showed us the marks in his hands and the wound in his side. Christ is risen. And Thomas says, that seems hard to believe. Why would he appear to you when I wasn't there? This seems like I am conveniently missing from all of the times when we see proof that he was risen. And he says, I will only believe if I too can see the risen Christ. And that, I think, would be fine. That, I think, would be great. I understand that place of saying, I also need to have this experience in order to believe that this experience is real. But then he pushes it a little farther. I will only believe if I see the risen Christ and I see the marks in his hands and I can stick my fingers in the marks in his hands. I will only believe if I see the risen Christ and I see the wound in his side, and I can take my hand and stick it into the wound in his side. Thomas moves from this place of asking for the same kind of evidence, the same kind of experience that everybody else has, to demanding more, and not just demanding more, but demanding something that is kind of intrusive. I mean, there is a big space between tell me the story, let me experience the story, let me stick my hand in someone. That moves from needing evidence to needing intrusiveness, to needing to break barriers, to needing to get into something. It is almost as though Thomas is in a place where he is not merely lacking belief, where he is not merely short on faith, but where he is turning away every bit of hope that comes his way. And I understand that because, let's face it, we've been there. We know what it is to occupy that place. We know what it is to have that kind of doubt of the soul, to have that kind of emotional doubt, to have that kind of thing that says, I will not accept any evidence. I will not accept any experience. I will not accept anything that directs me towards something better. I have decided to be hopeless. I have decided to be faithless. I have decided to hold my unbelief closely, to cherish it, because at least I can be certain of it. And that, I think, is right there what gets Thomas in a little bit of trouble. I think that right there is what moves Thomas from the realm of, if not a hero, at least someone who I understand, to someone who needs more than evidence, who needs more than an experience, who needs someone to hand him some faith, who needs someone to carry him, who needs someone to help him, who needs someone to love him, who needs someone to wrap him up and say, it's okay. You can take that dare to believe, that step into faith, and see how it feels. You don't have to just turn it aside. And then Jesus does appear. And if you want to see how Jesus deals with doubt, even this doubt of the soul, even this deep emotional doubt, even this kind of faithless uncertainty, here it is. Jesus shows up and says to Thomas, here are the marks, put your fingers in them. Here's the wound in my side, put your hand right in there. Jesus is not offended by this. Jesus is not angry at Thomas about this. Thomas is in a bad place, and Jesus and Christ shows up to hold him and to love him and to say, here you go, this is what you needed. I will give you what you needed. And Thomas is just open enough, has just enough space there to exclaim, my Lord and my God. Now, Jesus does have the little addendum on there. Have you believed because you have seen? Well, blessed are those who have not seen and yet who believe. But that's not directed at Thomas. That's directed to all the disciples who saw him. Jesus will give us what we need. But we are even more blessed when we are bold enough to take that risk, to step into that story, to say, maybe hope is possible. I will live as though there is hope. Maybe love is possible. I will live as though there is love. Maybe forgiveness is possible. I will live as though I am forgiven. Maybe redemption is possible. I will live as though I am redeemed. Maybe resurrection is possible. I will live as though I have been brought back to life. And blessed are we when we can take that leap of faith. But leaps of faith are next week. For now, we stand here. Doubt is fine. It is something that we all have. Unbelief is fine. It is something we all deal with. But when we are dealing with that, we must remain open to the possibilities that Christ offers. For real despair comes when we close ourselves off entirely, when we refuse to experience what Christ is offering us, when we dismiss what faith we have out of hand. So, be bold, be daring, be open to the possibility, and see what Christ will bring.